Welcome everyone to Connected Learning TVs. This is actually the 40th webinar in our series, and I'm happy to report that our content has been viewed in over 100 countries now. So we're really delighted to see such a diverse community developing around this work. For those of you who are joining us on live stream, we encourage you to use the chat stream in the live stream channel to connect with each other, introduce yourself, and also please feel free to post questions you might have that you want to introduce into the Hangout, and I will do my best to raise those questions to those folks gathered here with us. So there's also going to be a shared Google Doc that will be posted, a link will be posted in the live stream chat. So if you'd like to do some shared note taking on the Google Doc, we invite you to do that. So today we're delighted to have Juliet Schor joining us to lead the conversation today on how peer-to-peer technology is helping to enable a shift to sharing economy as an alternative to a consumer economy centered on private ownership. And we also have a fantastic group of folks joining us on the Hangout today. So before Julie takes the floor to do a brief presentation, as we usually do to launch the conversation, I did want to give everybody who is in the Hangout with us today a chance to introduce themselves before Julie's presentation. So I don't know, I guess I should prompt people to jump in. So if you could just state your name and affiliation and your connection to this topic, that would be fantastic. We have two Julies today, so why don't we start with Julie Keene.
Hi, I'm Julie Keene, and I'm the Senior Research Associate at VIF International Education. We bring international teachers to teach in U.S. schools, and we also develop professional development for U.S. teachers doing global learning. So I am working with about 1,000 teachers in open Moodle course using Mahara, and a lot of them are working with students talking about a lot of microfinance issues. So we're developing a lot of curriculum around shared economies globally. So I'm interested in sort of preparing and supporting teachers in doing that.
Very cool. Thanks, Julie. Cameron, you want to jump in?
So my name is Cameron Tonkinwise. I'm currently the Director of Design Studies at Carnegie Mellon's School of Design. I've been looking at issues of collaborative consumption primarily from the perspective of sustainability for about 10 years now. So I'm particularly interested in the way in which the decoupling of use and ownership can reduce societal materials intensity, which is a very jargonistic way of saying if we share more, we might just be a bit more sustainable.
Very interesting. Thanks, Cameron. Annie, do you want to jump in?
Sure. I'm a sociology PhD student at Harvard University. And I've been doing a lot of research on car sharing and time banks and simply looking at these different exchanges and how people are understanding them and kind of shifting from an ownership model to a sharing model.
Very cool. Luca.
Hi there, my name is Luca Carfagna. I am one of Julie's doctoral students in Boston College Sociology program. I'm studying open learning as part of the Connected Consumption team, and I helped out with the first part of the time banking research.
Great. And do we have Emily, another member of Julie's team?
I'm Emily Dubois. I'm also in the sociology program at BC, and for the last year and a half, I've been looking at some of the different motivations that drive people to participate in alternative economies. Specifically, as Luca said, we looked at a Boston time bank pretty extensively.
Great. Thanks, Emily. So again, today's discussion is going to be led by Juliet Schor, who's a professor of sociology at Boston College. I also have the great benefit of being able to work with Julie as part of the Connected Learning Research Network that I'm involved in. And within that network, Julie's focused on issues related to the conscious consumption movement and the relationship between some of the dynamics happening in that movement and what we've been looking at in the peer-to-peer learning and sharing in the learning and knowledge space. So it's been really a great addition to the conversation around connected learning. Julie has what's fascinating about Julie's work is not only does she have a strong social and scientific background in economics and sociology, but she's also highly involved herself as a very strong voice in issues such as sustainability, critiques of consumer culture, and so it's been really a wonderful sort of um, opportunity for us as researchers to engage not only in the empirical work, but also as activists and people interested in social change. Julie has really provided a lot of leadership in that area. So without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Julie to frame up our conversation.
Great. Well, thank you, Mimi, and thanks to everyone here in the Hangout. We have fantastic expertise arrayed along the bottom panel of this screen. And welcome to everyone else who's participating in this conversation. So I am looking at this phenomenon, which is was first known as the sharing economy, then was dubbed the collaborative economy. We at within the MacArthur group here call it connected consumption, in part to make the analogy to the connected learning work that we're doing, and also because that term both encompasses the the social connections that people are making, the ecological connections, and sort of connection to the earth that is a part of this phenomenon, and of course the digital connections, which are enabling the rapid innovation and expansion of this space of connected consumption. Before I get to some slides, I should also say that the phenomenon is, it's hard to bound as just a consumer phenomenon. It's also, there's an educational dimension to it, and Luca is working on that. There's also a production dimension to it, and we're going to be starting some new work on the sort of DIY maker spaces that are also part of this. So it's connected consumption, production, and learning. A kind of approach which is really transforming across these, transforming these couple of different sectors. So let me switch to some slides now, just to help us move through some of the material. So this is just the introductory slide. And I think we're going to have a few issues with the slides, I think. Are people able to see them? Or are they, okay, great. So there's in some ways nothing new about sharing. This picture of a tool library shows that you can share in very low-tech ways. Tool libraries became popular in the 20th century in low-income African-American communities where people like to do a lot of home renovation and work on their own spaces and the things, durable goods that they owned, but didn't have money to invest in expensive tools. And so they began sharing them. Of course, if we think back historically, we have, you know, most of the world operated according to principles of sharing for a very long time. There is a lot that's new about the sharing economy, and so we can look at some of the things which are new. Couch surfing, which was started in 1991, was one of the first platforms for a peer-to-peer innovation that paired people who wanted to travel and didn't want to pay for hotel rooms with others who had spare couches or rooms and were willing to welcome strangers into their room or home. The important thing that the digital platforms enabled these kinds of innovations to solve was the trust and reputation issues, because you can rate people, write about them. You can vet their reputations and so forth in very low-cost ways. You don't have to hire detective agencies or other kinds of agencies to do background checks and so forth. You can do it through a collaborative process online in which users give that information. Large-scale entities putting peers together became possible. And Annie's done a lot of work on that trust and reputation issue within the car sharing space. Bike sharing is another form of the sharing economy. Free cycle, which is a gift-giving exchange. And I'm going to go very quickly because I think people are probably very familiar with all these. Relay rides, the case that Annie has looked at in which people rent out their cars to others to drive. Land sharing, which puts together people with land who don't have gardening skills or don't have time to garden with people who don't have land and who want to garden. So there are a number of types of connected consumption. Some of it has to do with sharing assets like relay rides or land sharing. Some of it has to do with swapping of used goods, and that would be cases like, well, the early ones, Craigslist, trading services, that's a time bank, or things like Zarly, TaskRabbit, Hub Culture, buying goods and services online in secondary markets, so those are used purchases, loaning goods and services, Neighbor Goods, Share Some Sugar. There are many platforms now that allow people to do this. And there are also educational platforms like Skillshare where people teach each other. And then there's the whole finance side of things, Kickstarter being the most popular or well-known of the sort of peer financing sites. So as I said, these innovations are digitally enabled, which allows them to solve issues of trust and reputation in inexpensive ways. It's not that other forms couldn't solve issues of trust and reputation, but they do so in ways that allow for very open access. So pretty much anyone can come into the space. They do so with what economists call reduced transactions costs. So it's easy and not time consuming to make these kinds of trades or participate in these kinds of sharing activities. And the digital dimension also means that it is especially appealing for young people who tend to be much more oriented to a digital environment. We had a great quote with one of the people we interviewed for the Time Bank in which she said something about, she was very annoyed with someone else in the Time Bank who wanted to arrange the trade by telephone, you know, such an old-fashioned way of doing things, but she wanted to be able to go online at 3 in the morning and communicate. These initiatives are both profit and nonprofit. So something like Couchsurfing started out as a nonprofit. It's now a B Corp. Time banking is virtually all nonprofit. Zipcar is a for-profit, and many of the new entries into the space are for-profits because there's been a lot of hype about the profitability of this space, and so that's brought in venture capital and a lot of new entrants. One of the things about if you look at all the entities in the space, some of them are much more explicitly articulating values of what has come to be known as new economics. So the Time Bank is very new economics-y. It's oriented to a very egalitarian setup. Everyone's time trades equally. It's very much into building social capital, reducing ecological footprint. Something like TaskRabbit, which is a sort of cheap concierge service. You can go to this platform and put up a task that you want done, and the organization not employs in the old-fashioned sense, but has a group of rabbits available to step up to meet your every need in ways that are, many people would think are, not particularly conducive to really good, it's not a good job in the sense that we would think of as stable employment, high wages, career ladders, and so forth. So maybe a more problematic from the point of view of social justice kind of model than something like the time bank. Ambitions to scale and market dominance vary across the space. Some of the entrants there are very keen to become very large, dominate their markets. Others are much more in a social mission kind of space. I just want to mention that to some extent, my interest in this space comes out of a larger model of a new economy that I'm interested in, which also looks at changing property relations, changing uses of time, new ways of thinking about wealth, that I wrote about in this book, Plenitude. Okay, let me just, I think I was supposed to go for about 10 minutes and I've probably hit 10 minutes. So I'll just show a couple more slides and then open it up. This slide is about what is driving this phenomenon. And I guess the first point to make is that it's very overdetermined. So there are at least 5 big, we've identified at least 5 things that are pushing it. The first one is the technological. I've talked about that. The growing digitization of everyday life and that pull to digital practices. Second is what the technological platforms have made possible. So that's a kind of economic impacts of the technology, which are really important. The deteriorating labor market, especially for young people, is important in pulling people into this space because it allows 2 things. One is to get access to goods and services much more cheaply than buying them on the sort of usual consumer markets. And the other is that these spaces are also giving people ways of earning income. So if you have a car, you can earn some money participating in relay rides, or you might rent out your driveway, or you may sell some of your stuff online, or you may get access to goods and services through a time bank. So the economic is important. Growing ecological consciousness is very important in driving people to these low footprint activities. There's a strong social pull. Many of the people we interviewed talk about social isolation, the desire to go back to more connected social settings and sort of neighborhoods where people knew each other. And these are platforms that aim to do that. They have the ambition of connecting people, many of them. And finally, there's a kind of cultural backlash, particularly since the downturn in 2008 against hyperconsumption and more emphasis on sort of downscaling and a critique of normative consumer patterns. And all of those have played into the growing popularity of this space. So I'm just going to mention the 3 cases that we're working on right now, and then I'll stop. The first I've already mentioned, the Cambridge Time Trade Circle, Boston Time Trade Circle, it's the biggest time bank in the country, and we have spent almost a year doing interviews and participant observation with people and young people who are part of this time bank, and we have a lot of interesting results that we could talk about in the discussion portion. Luca's doing a study of open education, open learning, and we're looking at people rather than sites, people who are taking their education into their own hands in a sense and actively putting together learning portfolios using open access online resources that are available. And so we're looking at the kinds of people who are doing this, how it's working out, what are the barriers to access for people who come to this space without a lot of economic or cultural capital. That class theme is very large for us in that study. And then Connor Fitzmaurice, who's a PhD student at Boston University, is heading up our food swapping case, and this is a kind of hipster. Done, and there are a variety of practices around the sharing of food that we're going to be looking at in that one. So I think I will stop now, and we can maybe whatever we go to now.
Great, thanks so much, Julie. So what we usually do now is just invite everybody in the Hangout who wants to pose a question or has a comment based on what Julie's presented.
So I've just got a quick question. I mean, Julie, you said it's a broad field, and certainly there are lots of family resemblances across lots of the examples that you've given, but I'm just wondering about when and where it's appropriate to draw distinctions within those categories. So, for example, it would seem to me that just anthropologically, or rather anthropology would want to insist on a fairly big difference between somebody who has surplus goods or goods with surplus use value and who effectively give that away and quite literally give over ownership and it's gone. And that's a one-way transaction and it's disappearing, versus lending, in which case I'm giving it away, but with the expectation that I will retain ownership and it will come back to me. And then thirdly, which I think is the real distinction between somebody who says, well, I'm only really prepared to engage in facilitating the flow of these goods if you give me some money. So I'm moving from lending to a kind of leasing or hiring. And I think, I mean, just my context for this comment is that you're seeing a lot of the startups in the sharing economy / collaborative consumption, and this is precisely a kind of tension, wondering how they can market themselves, brand themselves on the one hand as being super friendly and nice because we're all engaged in sharing and it's in a gift economy on the one hand, and yet on the other saying this is a really good way to make a lot of money. You can pay for your college if you engage in Airbnb or something like that. And it's a very interesting brand tension, and then it seems to me also a disciplinary tension. So I'm just wondering about some of the distinctions within this broad field, particularly on that economic anthropology side.
Yeah, well, that's a great question, and one of the slides I skipped over, I think, poses something along those lines. We have thought about, I think the sort of, I've thought about it mostly in terms of profit and non-profit, and that's one way to cut it. The way you cut it is also really interesting. The thing about I think probably we have closer to 2 categories than 3, because well, first of all, if we think about gift economies, they're almost always economies of reciprocity. And even if you take something like Free Cycle, which is probably the biggest operating gift site, they're organized by communities, and if you join a community, you are expected to give and receive. So that's part of the way it works. So we can to some extent we have these economies of reciprocity which are operating outside of the monetary. I mean, the monetized and non-monetized is another dimension of this, because something like a time bank is a non-monetized, and you have others where there's no money changing hands. And then you have the the selling, the leasing, etc. Those where you have money, and then you also have some interesting cases like the hub culture where they're creating a new currency. They call it Ven, and we haven't studied that one yet. But these are really important differences. Part of what we're trying to do with the work is to, by studying cases that are located in different parts of this space, to see how they're working differently. But I absolutely share your intuition, or share your point of view that you've got a lot of actors in the space who basically are there to make money, and they sort of, if you take Zipcar as like the archetypal example of this, it pretty quickly morphed into something very ordinary in terms of a business. I mean, I wouldn't even put it in this space anymore, although they would locate themselves there, but it doesn't look much different from Hertz or Avis, except that it's hipper. But Hertz and Avis now rent by the hour, and so yeah, it's a really key issue.
Julie, just to build on this conversation, maybe pose a question for Luca related to it. So I think what I'm curious about is the differences and similarities in terms of systems that are based on the exchange of goods or time, and those that are based on a sharing economy around knowledge and learning, which is not it's not the scarcity equation works differently in that space. And I'm just sort of curious because I do think you're identifying a shared set of trends and levers and a shared ethos, but then the actual materiality of what's exchanged is so different in the learning space. So I don't know, Julie, if you or Luca have something to say about that.
Do you want Luca to go first? Or do you want me to go first? Or
I don't mind jumping in.
Okay.
First of all, I apologize. I think I have a bit of a lag on my account here. One thing I think the difference that I'm really seeing is, you brought up the material part, and when people are sharing material goods, they're tapping into that idling capacity, which there is still a finite capacity of that idling capacity, even if we're, cracking into more of a good than we're used to because we're sharing it. Whereas I think what I'm starting to get from the open learners is that there's kind of this exponential capacity that comes from the knowledge sharing, that the way people are remixing and the way people are, finding new ways to learn and connect, that there is no real finite capacity to the knowledge that's being passed around. So I guess that's something that I would identify as a difference.
So in economics, the thing about knowledge and information is that it's non-rival. So one person's consumption of it doesn't affect another's, which is not the case for most material goods. Now, what's interesting about the durable goods is that they're a little bit non-rival, in the sense that you can lend someone else your lawnmower and still use your lawnmower. So the temporal dimension is rival, but for long-lasting goods, you have a lot of non-rivalness over their lifetime. So the economics of those things are quite different, because the efficient outcomes for the non-rival goods are free access. That's a point that economists have known for a long, long time, but has kind of really, they've forgotten about. We've got lots of things which should be free access, where the marginal cost of providing them is zero, which means their price should be zero, that are being, where high prices are being charged, and the justification for that is, it creates innovation, and we wouldn't get invention and so forth if we didn't reward those providers. But it's kind of a non sequitur. There are, as we have found with contests and other things, there are lots of ways to reward innovation, invention, and so forth without creating inefficient economic arrangements.
Yeah, and I think that seems to be one of the things that the whole discussion around the massively open online courses is pushing. So I don't know, Julie Keen, you're doing some experimentation in this space. I don't know if you want to jump in on this thread. Oh, I think you're muted.
There we go.
That's good. Oh, we lost you again.
How's that? Okay. So I'm actually interested in the political. So that wasn't actually articulated in the 5 categories, because I'm looking at open learning for teachers in a very political space, and how to provide online learning for them that is open, allows for them to learn, yet when they are translating that knowledge and sharing that knowledge, often it is in very closed, very politicized spaces like public schools. And so I'm curious about the sort of open learning possibilities for not only teachers, but a lot of learners that are in these highly politicized spaces, and how you take the sort of open learning you might get in a MOOC or in other PLNs and translate that into very politicized spaces. That makes sense.
Yeah, I don't know that I have an answer to that at this point, because we've been looking at the sort of political ideology of people who are involved in this, the political motivations. But because we're not studying, in the open learning case, we're not studying the sites yet. So which is, I think, what you're talking about, which is these sort of politicized arenas.
Yeah.
We're studying people.
Mm-hmm.
So we haven't done the kind of institutional analysis that you would probably need to answer that question. Now, Luca may want to, chime in. We're also looking at an older population. We're looking at 18 to 34s.
Right, and in some cases with teachers, we are too. I'm actually also interested in the reputation communities, so how they work differently in knowledge production as opposed to, those 2 distinctions you were making around sort of knowledge and goods and services, and how reputation communities operate in these 2 different areas.
Yeah, well, there's been a fair amount of work on that in the programming space.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know. Other people here would know better than I haven't seen. Annie, that you would know more about that. We're looking at it more in the goods and
Mm-hmm.
services space. But or I don't know, Luca, you were shaking your head there.
I think, getting at the politicized part, you're right, Julie, we haven't done a lot to get the institutionalized analysis of this, but I think in studying the people and the users, it was an attempt to look at an alternative organizational design, because people are using across platforms and kind of creating the organization, or at least the institutional field, for themselves. What's neat about that is that puts pressure back on the organization. There's an offline school that is in the startup community here in Boston that I've worked with and kind of interviewed one of their key innovators, and they're looking to go towards a free model, not because they don't want to make money, but because they decided that their role in this space is very different than they had initially imagined themselves kind of at the first round of the startup. So I think it's interesting how the way people are using this stuff is putting kind of pressure on the almost institutional design of the field, and that's really neat.
That's interesting. Annie, did you want to jump in on this issue?
Sure. I guess I don't have a lens for looking at the politics of the issue. As Julia was mentioning, this is the reputation. It's more easily built, or has been more traditionally built, in the goods network. So, for instance, with car sharing, you can review the car, and people can leave comments, and then the owners can change things. And it's interesting because you don't really see this play out with services. And in a sense, I think it might be, when I'm comparing car sharing to time banking, this might actually be because of the nature of time banking versus the nature of car sharing. With time banking, it's more of a personal production where people are trading services with one another, and the idea of reviewing someone who has done something quote unquote for free, and reviewing them badly is has a lot more negative connotations than, say, reviewing a car badly. So I think that, you know, the nature of reputation building in when you're talking about services versus goods is very different.
That's really interesting. So you're saying it's somehow the combination of free and the service orientation inhibits that reputational economy because you have a lot of reputation systems in the service sector for commercial entities, right?
Right,
That's well
exactly.
established, but something about free inhibits people that whole rating and reputation scheme. Am I understanding what you're saying?
Yes, exactly. Because when it's, and I say free because, you know, they are, with the time bank, they are paying with hours. It's just our understanding of that type of compensation is very different from how we think about money. And so, and also just the nature of the community, you know, it's the community, it's much more focused on giving as opposed to, you know, you might see in Yelp. Uh, it's it's the regular economic market, and so something changes about the intentions of the services, and that ultimately impacts like people's willingness to negatively review people, I think.
That's interesting. I think, you know, maybe as a not necessarily a counterexample, but a slightly adjacent domain is karma systems on forums and Q&A forums where there is a really robust reputational system within the context of free knowledge exchange. So I think there is a huge incentive to vet the credibility of expertise and knowledge, which is being
Mhm.
addressed by a lot of reputation schemes, but it's not, these are often highly anonymized. They're not as person-centered as your time banking case. So there may be something, I don't know, it's interesting what the cultural breakage points are there.
I was just going
Yeah.
to say, I mean, I've been seeing this a lot with the open educational resources. So K-12 educators also are extremely nervous about OER, about when they're free, are they valid, and who's vetting it. And so when teachers tend to share curriculum, which is definitely a shared consumption, a shared production, trying to kind of oppose a little bit of textbooks and even stuff that's sort of handed down in pacing guides and structured curriculum. Often they are very reluctant to criticize each other, and so the reputation of whose lesson plans and whose curriculum that are teacher created gets very difficult to vet because they won't criticize. It's very similar to what you are talking about in the sort of free economy.
That's fascinating. I
Um,
think,
so
oh,
can I
go
jump
ahead.
in there? Sorry, just on that. I mean, I think this is a really important point that ranges across all the different aspects of kind of collaboration that we're talking about, whether it's collaborative learning or whether it's collaborative consumption, which is the kind of recognition that comes out of a lot of tragedy of commons work that punishing is itself a kind of commons dilemma, in that everybody benefits if somebody steps up and punishes somebody for breaking the social norms of the sharing contract. But there is excessive cost to the individual who puts their hand up to say, I am the one who is going to punish. And so it becomes a problem. Everybody in the community hopes somebody is going to do the social policing, and nobody's prepared to be the individual who's actually going to do the social policing. And so it's for this reason that you'll see a lot, I would suggest you would see a lot of resistance to these communities actually engaging in the kind of critical work which is going to be needed to actually make them robust communities. And so, for example, I'm just trying to think of the study in my back of my mind, which is the one stalling, but I can't remember it, on couch surfing, which just indicated that only like 1 in 100 reviews are ever negative. It really is a very big issue to think that you're going to step up and say that your couch surfing host wasn't adequate, or that your couch surfing guest, partly because the whole culture of couch surfing is you're an incredibly tolerant person who's going to put up with really anything. And if you have a problem with your host or guest, then guess what? Couch surfing's not for you. And so the mechanisms by which these platforms allow critique is extraordinarily immature. And there's a lot of work to be done to work out how people can engage in critical activities that are going to sustain the social norms that make the sharing sustainable, whether it's of learning in non-rival good spaces or whether it's of physical products in rival good spaces.
That's really interesting.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a great point. I guess what I would say is, I wonder if the problem, or if it's that they're immature, or that with the early adopters you have an unusual group. So they tend to be the true believers, and they're the ones who are super responsible and so forth, and that the problem of poor quality or moral hazard and so on and so forth comes in much more in later stages. Now, couchsurfing's been around for a long time, so it might be an interesting one to look at from that point of view. But that also brings me to another point about it, which is, it's a kind of related point, I think, which is size. And so if these things get too big, does it get harder to manage the incentives and the punishment and all of the basic economics that you need to keep the system working well? And so maybe that sort of drive to dominate the market and become the General Motors or the Walmart of each of these spaces that relates back to the point Cameron was making at the beginning. Maybe that's not a good way to go, because we do know that sharing works better, under with certain configurations. I mean, we certainly know that from looking at the common pool resources work, and then when things get too big, it gets too hard to manage with a shared system.
Emily, do you want to jump in? I see that you have a question, I think, in the live stream, so since we have you in the Hangout as well.
Sure. Mimi, which question were you interested in?
Oh, feel free to jump in with whatever you like.
I guess most related to this conversation that's going on right now is, as Annie was mentioning, there's some shifting expectations when the service exchange is free. And I wonder if any of you all could comment within the data that you've gathered so far about whether or not those expectations have actually, you've observed them as actually altered. Are they, because in my case, for example, the more ideologically oriented time bankers who came to the service exchange alternative economy as a more community service type activity where they really were looking to help others within their community, and they viewed that as part of their I guess method or civic engagement. For those people, I could have some clear observations about the alterations of their exchanges. However, there are other folks who were trying to have more of an economic gain through their involvement in the barter economy, and I wonder across the different cases what the ideology of those entering these shared consumptive arrangements has to do with the expectations for how the exchanges within them will go.
Trying to think about that.
Good question.
That's a good question.
I mean, I think one of the things, I've been sort of interested in the peer production kind of space and things like open source and Wikipedia and so on, which I think, again, is an adjacency to some of these issues that we're talking about. And I think in those studies, they've shown that the high functioning systems are really constructed through a diversity of motivations and entry points, so that people will generally cite I think I'm thinking of Karim Lakhani's work, where he's saying there's usually an ideological motivation, there's a learning motivation, and then there's some kind of extrinsic / financial motivation I feel like there's a fourth, but it's actually different people are participating, and the reputational and social motivation. So those four, and high functioning systems usually in the open and network space usually embody all of them. So at one level it's conflictual, but if you look systemically, so there's a lot of argument within the community about why are people participating, and what are the more valuable forms of participation, especially when monetary considerations enter in. There's a lot of tension around that, but when you look systemically at the functioning of the system, the most sustainable and robust and expansive ones tend to have all of those motivations embedded in them. But I don't know if that plays out within the specific domain of, connected consumption in the same way.
So I was going to jump in, but there's a lot of construction noise in my house all of a sudden. One of the things I just draw attention to is some of the work that the Sage Foundation did, publishing a book under the title Trust Without Cooperating Without Trust. And it's a somewhat conservative sociological argument saying that the moment one of the kind of reasons why money exists is in order to enable you to engage in cooperative relations without trust. And so it becomes a very interesting mix, almost of the question I asked at the beginning, about the kind of difference between gifting and somebody trying to make money out of surplus goods. It becomes a very interesting situation when somebody says, well, I want money to be engaged in the transaction, but not because I want to make money, but because it becomes a kind of proxy for trust. So it actually puts me into a contractual situation. Obviously, nobody would actually engage the rule of law if I failed to get a latte for $3 after handing over my money, but it becomes a kind of a symbolic holder of how to actually engage in trust with strangers.
That's interesting. So the role of money starts playing a different kind of playing a different kind of role. I don't know, Julie, if you wanted to.
Well, one of the things it is a really interesting point. I think one of the things we know from people like Zelizer, but also just other studies of money, is how the sort of simple-minded conceptualizations of money that have come out of economics are so simple-minded and wrong, in the sense that it really can. I mean, we've got to really look at it in this more. I mean, she's a sociologist, but anthropological way to understand that it, like anything else, is really polyvalent in terms of its symbolic, practical, and other meanings and uses. So, yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah, Julie, go ahead.
So one of the things that's been really interesting is I went to high school the other day in rural North Carolina, and one of the central components of their curriculum in this elective course is Kiva. And so I'm just curious about this idea of social entrepreneurship. And there are schools, particularly in these areas of the rural South, that always do a lot of global action through charity. And there are schools that are trying to reorient these classes and trying to have them use microfinance as a way of getting globally engaged. And I'm curious if anybody's done studies around this idea of social entrepreneurship and used Kiva, looked at Kiva, about how people are getting involved in those kinds of small businesses internationally.
Yeah, we haven't. This is the one piece of the space that we haven't really looked at all. So we've just, there are only so many parts of this.
Yeah.
It's such an expansive space at this point.
But just anecdotally, I was on the board of a not-for-profit when I was in New York called IOBI, which stands for In Our Backyards, and they are a crowd resourcing platform for environmental actions at a local level. And I certainly did no study on this. It wasn't my kind of relation to the organization, but just anecdotally, it was very interesting compared to Kickstarter, which commodifies an initiative and makes, really encourages people who have no connection to the locals to actually contribute. And that's precisely the value of the digital platform in that regard. IOBI, because it was about local environmental initiatives, was just using an online platform to lower the transaction costs for locals to raise money for local projects. But because they were online and because IOBI themselves were trying to increase the scale of their operation, all of a sudden local initiatives would start to receive money from around the world, mainly around New York, but then increasingly around America. And it was, again, interesting in terms of Julie's point about how ambivalent money is when one actually looks at the ethnography of money. A lot of these people felt sometimes contaminated when non-local money was starting to boost their own projects in the Far Rockaways or something. And they kind of wanted the platform and its scalability purely to enable their own local initiatives. And so again, I think it's very interesting looking at that ambiguity that in that crowd resourcing way, who is the crowd that you are resourcing from, and when do you want them to be anonymous, and when do you really want to know where the money is coming from and re-embed those moneyed relations back in social relations.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think just to pose a question that sort of builds on that comment, one thing that we were talking about in the Hangout before we went live was just the issue of, on the scaling issue, whether these economies or platforms that are sort of in the shadow or alternative sector are really going to push into the more mainstream and reach a tipping point with, acquiring some sort of dominance or at least a larger presence. And, I think it relates in part to the cultural specificity of some of the folks participating in these systems, which is something that I've learned from Julie's team, and the kind of cultural capital it takes to gain entry into sharing economies, some of the issues around trust and social networks. And I'm just curious if, Julie or anybody else wants to comment about their intuitions of how broad these systems can really go.
Well, my sense is that they're going to get very big, but the issue is really sort of what it's the one that Cameron raised at the beginning, which is kind of what their character is going to be as that happens, and whether they. I mean, I see the biggest sort of threat to them, their ability to really transform our economy and society and culture, which is, why I'm interested in them, that potential. The biggest threat to them is that they become sort of profit-driven organizations that mostly operate just like the profit-driven corporations we have today, but they've cut out middlemen, or they've done one other thing that allowed them to gain a market advantage, but that they're in most respects don't transform either the distributions of power, access, opportunity, income, wealth, etc. So I think, to me, that's the big issue, not how big do they get, because in some of these cases, you can see that the old way of doing things is pretty inefficient, and the incumbents in the spaces are going to get really either pushed out or dramatically reduced in size. I mean, think of something like Airbnb in super expensive cities, where just getting a hotel room is it's prohibitive for most people. So now you have another way to do that. You dramatically expand the presence of this Airbnb in that city, but it ends up really operating just like just like a sort of the standard hotel sector in a certain sense, which is just, it's a very transactional very transactional thing. In our work, we've differentiated, Emily used the word, our ideological time bankers. So we're differentiating between the people who have a pretty transactional approach to these things and those who have a more ideological, that may not be the right counterposing to the transactionals. For the transactionals, it's not that different than what they would be doing at a purchasing something at a mall or in a hotel, or they're looking for something similar. It may be cheaper, it may be faster, it may be a little more efficient, but effectively most of the characteristics of that exchange, they want to be the same, versus people who are really interested in a very different kind of relationship of provisioning or service.
Thanks, Julie. That's super helpful. We're nearing the top of our hour now. That went really fast. So before I close, I wanted to invite everybody on the Hangout if they had any last comments that they wanted to make. I don't know. Annie, do you want to jump in?
Sure. I just wanted to pick up a little bit on what Julia was saying about, the chance for these organizations and these programs to really take off. And I think the other thing to think about is what is actually being exchanged in these transactions. So for instance, with the car sharing, one of the reasons why it hasn't taken off is because people are really, really uncomfortable sharing their car. It's not normal to them. It's something that's very private and very personal. And I think that as it becomes normalized, as people engage in this more, it has a greater opportunity to take off. But just again, as we're considering, which programs might be more or less successful, we have to think about the nature of our, the meaning behind the things we're exchanging in these transactions.
Yeah, really interesting. Cameron.
Sorry, Annie, I might just take an opportunity to completely disagree. So I think what the sharing economy, I think, reveals is the extent to which capitalist understandings of consumption have overplayed the affect relations between people and their products, and that people, in fact, have a much more commodified use-value relation to a lot of their possessions. In which case I would say that a lot of the reason why people are not sharing are purely functional, and they have to do with the fact that, as I kind of indicated in the notes before, almost everything that's being shared at the moment was never designed to be shared, and so quite materially it's very difficult to share it, just because it hasn't been designed for multiple owners. We've had, our houses are filled with 20th century products designed for individual ownership, and now we're struggling to share them, and that's going to be a problem. And then secondly, the same goes for the legal institutions that are kind of structuring our everyday practices. Right now you're seeing collaborative consumption, startups forming lobby groups to petition for the changing of regulations, particularly around insurance, that would actually make it much more normalized to share a car. I think the number of people who have a really strong affective relationship to their car are small and pathological.
So this will be an interesting debate to see how it plays out, because I think it is an empirical question at the end of the day, but a really, really interesting one to see how it'll play out. Julie Keen.
Can you hear me, or did I put myself back on mute?
You're good.
I'm actually wanting to pick up on that point about these issues of shared practice and how these communal spaces of shared production actually affect the social practices. So in my field of teaching, how are teachers sort of coming into these open spaces and then re-emerging in a social space that's highly, highly politicized and constrained? And are these starting to sort of open those spaces up? And are they similarly having these lobbying groups that you mentioned of insurance companies, of shared cars, because teaching was a closed door practice for many, many years. And we are trying to, over the last several decades really, open this space up. And the institutions in which this teaching happens is very resistant to this opening up. And so I'm curious, even last week's conversation of how informal affects formal, I think this is all really connected, not to overuse that word, of when and how these start to really break apart some of these institutional practices where these learners are operating. So.
Yeah, I really appreciate you bringing sort of the policy and organizational angle into this because I think it's critical, especially in the learning space. Luca.
Yeah, I think to kind of echo a little bit of what Julie was saying, I think one thing that I've been seeing a lot with my case is that when these platforms and organizations become really sustainable and transformative is when their users drive the creation of kind of a natural ecology for them, which is kind of why I found myself in startup culture a little bit, is because people are finding a community for the learning. The learning is kind of almost auxiliary to what they're trying to get out of their lives, and that's when they become very ideological. They don't walk in ideological, but they become very ideological after the fact. But I think I echo what Julie is saying is that, there aren't a lot of rules in startup culture, which is I think also why people are finding a natural home there. These other places where I think people would like to be, there are a lot of institutional boundaries. And I think for a lot of these startups like Airbnb, for example, they have a great opportunity to mobilize their users and push against some of the laws that are hanging out there in New York City that are preventing them from, allowing them to actually participate in Airbnb. As it stands right now, it doesn't seem like they're taking that opportunity. So it does need to get a little bit political in order for, I think, things to become sustainable and transformative.
Right, right. Is Emily still with us?
Yes.
Emily, do you want to have a last comment before Julie closes?
And I actually, to just build off what Luca was saying, I actually, I believe that we have to really be cautious about the way we think about putting that kind of political action and pushing back against a very large and powerful bureaucratic system among the users of the sharing economy. For example, I know recently there was an Airbnb case in which someone was fined tens of thousands of dollars because the actual practice of renting out your apartment or room within New York City is illegal. And of course, the people who do participate on Airbnb sign, of course, their terms and agreement, which states that. However, I think when we, as getting back to Julie's point about the mechanisms within this space, Airbnb is not taking a lot of, or did not take a lot of responsibility in this case, aside from having the kind of stock message up on their website. And so I think that the content, I'd say the content and character of the organizations will be determinative as far as how much movement the connected consumption is able to make against a lot of the more stratified and structured legal boundaries that, Luca, you were just referencing are kind of absent in your case.
Yeah, and I think there's precedence in the copyright wars and how you saw groups like Wikimedia step up to PIPA SOPA. And so it'll be interesting whether in the sharing economy space there'll be a similar kind of broadly shared political consciousness about the political structures that limit their growth and spread. Julie, last words of wisdom for us.
Well, I think it'll be a while before the actors in this space have that kind of shared political view. It will be interesting to see if it happens. One of the things I'm interested in is getting more people studying the economics of all of this. And I think a lot of the issues that Cameron raised today, we need to think about and sort of, looking at them with economic models or analytic models, as well as the kind of qualitative work that we're doing. I do think the sort of cultural, political, and social dimensions are important. One of the things we've been finding with the Time Bank case is that a lot of people were looking for social connection, and of course, creating more social connection is a stated goal with a lot of these initiatives, and that has been harder to achieve than people anticipated. So that's one of the things we didn't talk too much about, but I think it's been an important thing. And then, of course, back to the really important question of what in the end are the eco footprints and the carbon footprints of these kinds of initiatives, and are they going to live up to their potential? One of the most disappointing things for me about Zipcar is that, well, you know, that it makes a partnership with Ford to provide SUVs, that it is now really enabling college students to have access to cars in ways they didn't before. And I know Cameron's located there now at CMU with all of the people who actually do the hard work of studying these life cycle effects of products. And I, you know, would love to see, and it sounds like probably that's a lot of what you're doing, is looking at what the overall eco impacts of these kinds of activities are, and I think that's a really important part. It's a fabulous space to do research in because there's so much happening, and you know, not that many researchers yet. And I also think it's just a really exciting place to be. So everyone who's out there, please be in touch with us, and we're all really excited about this space and the work that's going on. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Julie, and thank you to Emily, Luca, Annie, Cameron, and Julie Keene for joining us today. I think it was a fantastically interesting and productive discussion. We invite everybody to continue the conversation through Twitter with our Connected Learning hashtag, or also on the webpage for the webinar, which will have a full recording of this session later today, together with content curated from this session. There's an opportunity to continue the discussion there as well. The next Connected Learning TV webinar will be Thursday, December 20th at 10 a.m. Pacific with Steve Hargadon, exploring the topic of changing education by hacking at the roots, not the branches, which I think is relevant also to our discussion today. So thanks, everybody, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.